This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com in review, and what I'm looking at today is 2007's Diary of the Dead, directed by George Romero. Did you know that George Romero is 6'5"? The man is tall. It's something I was never aware of because all the images I've seen of him, they never put him in a context, which is to say, I always assumed he was short. Though that's not the case. The man is just really tall. And what's interesting about that for me is that he's not only physically tall, his influence over horror is so great, even today, to the degree that, in my mind, when I think of slow-moving zombies, those are Romero zombies. If you watch zombie movies at all, you'll notice that more modern iterations tend to be more animalistic, bestial, and very quick moving. That's something that people like Zack Snyder and Danny Boyle, well, technically not Danny Boyle, because in his 28 Days Later, they're technically not dead, but it's close enough. Though George Romero always stuck to the more traditional interpretation of a zombie. And perhaps more importantly, he tended to introduce a political context to his zombie movies. Diary of the Dead revolves around a group of college students from the University of Pennsylvania. While at school, they noticed that there are news reports revolving around people who are seemingly dead but come back to life, so to speak, in that they become animate and they become aggressive, but they are technically dead. And as a result, this causes them to abandon their movie project that they're working on and instead begin to document what's happening all around them in the real world. And so these students get a Winnebago and decide to try to go home, understandably to reach their relatives and so on, to be with them in this time, though they don't quite understand what is going on around them. As I mentioned earlier, George Romero's zombie movies tend to be about more than zombies. They oftentimes have a political context, and they work in such a way that they're actually talking about something. It may not be obvious, but it's there. For instance, I would think that George Romero's most popular movie is Dawn of the Dead. If you've seen it, you'll notice that the dead seem to congregate in a mall. The movie doesn't overtly tell you why they're doing it, though upon listening to interviews and discussions about this movie, you come to the conclusion that they're doing it because of consumerism, which is to say that they're dead, yet the only thing that they can recall in their death is a mall. So they head to it. And as a result, the movie is a commentary on that consumerism, which is a pretty powerful notion and something that's way too normal in American society by my reckoning. Namely, the idea that people shop, people buy stuff, as opposed to understanding themselves and the world around them. We buy things to placate ourselves, to make ourselves comfortable. And Dawn of the Dead explored that through a meta-commentary about consumerism with zombies. It's almost as if George Romero uses zombies to impart ideas and concepts that, if left on their own, viewers might not be too engaged with. And in that vein, George Romero tended to also have movies revolving around African American protagonists because, based on what I've read, he thought, very valid I might add, that African American people in horror movies tend to be the first to die and also tend to be very minor in terms of the roles that they play. And once again, that meta commentary is present. George Romero is so clever as a writer-director that you don't see what he's doing until later. And George Romero does this in a lot of his movies, which is to say, they are larger than the subject matter may lead you to believe. And I think this playing with racial designations exists also in Diary of the Dead, particularly where there's a scene when the college students encounter a bunch of people who have held up in a warehouse, and they have tons of food, gasoline, which the students need. The people who are in this warehouse are for the most part black people, and there's a conversation about looting, and George Romero, because he wrote the movie as well, addresses this point. And it's a point of view that is not typical for movies. Because in most movies, if there's looting going on, they typically say that it is the looters being animals and criminals and that type of thing. Heck, in the news, that's the impression they give. But Romero looks a little bit deeper, and he finds a justification for what they're doing. You might not agree with it, but it's as valid a point of view as any other. Another thing is that George Romero doesn't seem particularly fond of people who sit on their asses while terrible things happen around them. I mention this because this tendency is epitomized in a character named Jason Creed, who is the director of the student film, as well as the person who's filming his documentary about the rise of the dead. What Jason Creed does is he films no matter what. And this is an interesting notion because no matter what happens with his friends, he still films. They could literally be threatened by whatever, yet he keeps filming. And my interpretation of what George Romero was saying, at any rate, is that this is cowardice. This is nothing more than a person who, for whatever reason, does not want to engage with what's actually going on. And they hide behind a camera. There are scenes in the movie when Jason Creed's friends are literally threatened in terms of their lives, and he's still with the camera. He never puts it down, no matter what's actually happening around him. Though, as I said, Romero doesn't glamorize this trait. He calls it out for what it is. It's cowardice. It is moral cowardice. And I appreciate that because, once again, it's not something you traditionally see, though it has the curious side effect of making a person always walking around filming stuff plausible. Diary of the Dead is done in a found footage fashion, so there is always someone shooting video. In most found footage movies, the justification for people filming stuff is typically really weak, and it undermines the entire story because you wonder why they don't just drop the camera and get out of whatever situation they're in. Though in the case of Diary of the Dead, it makes more sense because it's established that Jason is fairly obsessed with what he's doing. The question is why. But nonetheless, he is obsessed with what he's doing. So when he doesn't come to aid of his friends who are literally threatened by zombies, you don't like it, but you get it. You don't question it in the way that you would in most other movies. What generally shocked me about Diary of the Dead is that it's really funny. And George Romero is not typically known for his writing, but this movie is funny. And he wrote and directed, as I said earlier. And it's funny in a way that I like, which is to say you have people commenting on events that happen around them. It is not a comedy. There are no jokes, but people do things like in reality, and people respond to those things. And that response is oftentimes funny. And that's what George Romero does really well in this movie. I should mention that I've seen Diary of the Dead before, though I didn't quite appreciate it as much as I did the second time around. It is a blast, and it is really, once again, funny, but it is situational. It is dark, but it is also funny. And that type of funny extends not only from people involved with whatever situation people are dealing with in the movie, but to some of the gore effects, which are just so bizarre and out there, but realistically rendered, that they're just really interesting to watch. This movie is fun, and that's not something I thought I would typically say about a George Romero movie. And speaking of George Romero, which is part of the point of this entire review, I need to rewatch his 2009 movie, Survival of the Dead, because, like in the case of Diary of the Dead, I've seen it before, though I don't recall liking it all that much. It had this very Hatfields versus McCoy storyline, and that didn't really resonate for me. But, as I said, I also saw Diary of the Dead before, and man, this movie is just so much fun. It's a great little movie. It's found footage style, but it's done in such a way that it doesn't irritate. Though it bears repeating that the zombie films of George Romero have an underlying political context. And based upon some of his movies I've seen later, I thought that it became too obvious. And when things become too obvious, it feels like someone is becoming pedantic. That being said, I'll take George Romero being pedantic any day of the week over movies that, while on the surface they may look interesting, if you look a little deeper, there's nothing really there. So what do you think? This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com interview. Do you agree, disagree? Let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like or a follow. Peace.